morning, everybody, and welcome to Internet Network Experts CCI Routing and Switching Advanced Troubleshooting Bootcamp. I am Brian McGann, and I will be your primary instructor for the week. Later this week, I will also be joined by Anthony Sequeira, one of my colleagues, and also a CCI instructor. Now, before we get started here into any of our content, I want to do a brief overview of the online classroom software for those of you that are not familiar with it, and talk a little bit about how we are going to be interacting throughout the week as we move through the class content. Now, first and foremost, the biggest thing that you need to know about the Adobe Classroom server here, if you go up to the meeting menu and go down to Manage My Settings, My Connection Speed, you can adjust your bandwidth sampling value up or down depending on your connection to the internet and depending on the quality of the sampling rate that you are getting. So if you find that throughout the day, anytime that either Anthony or myself are talking or doing examples, if you have any type of bandwidth issues, you can go ahead and adjust that there under the My Connection Speed. Now, for questions throughout the day, anytime that we are lecturing or going over examples or doing a lab scenario, feel free to ask us questions. And if you take a look on the right-hand portion of the screen under the questions Q&A box, you can just go ahead and type your question in there. And when you submit it, it is going to be submitted just to Anthony and myself privately. It will not be publicly posted to the class. Now, if your question is of interest to everyone, we can publish it to everyone. But feel free to ask anything because those questions will be private unless it is going to be of everyone's advantage to answer it. Now, one thing I will mention here about the questions that you are asking, Cisco's non-disclosure agreement, as we know, for taking the CCI lab exam, basically says that we cannot talk about the actual exam content on the actual exam questions. So the information that we're going to be covering this week, it will be related to the technologies that are on the CCI lab exam, but obviously it's not going to be the actual questions of the exam. So I just ask that as you are formatting questions towards myself or towards Anthony, do be aware of that. We don't want to know what you got on your exam or what you heard someone else got on their exam, both for our sake and for your sake, the protection against the NDA agreement. Now, for any reason, if you do run into any trouble with the classroom throughout the week, you can give our support line a call there. You can see the international number and then the toll-free number for the U.S. Also, you could go to our website at ine.com and start a support ticket chat. And if there's any issues there that I cannot personally answer as I'm teaching the class, or Anthony, our support staff is more than willing to help you out there. Now again, my name is Brian McGann, so for those of you that are not familiar with me, I am a 3-time CCIE in routing and switching, service provider, and security. Now, all 3 exams that I took have been in the one-day format. So it was right about the time that I took the exam in 2002. It was about maybe 2 or 3 months before that they changed over from the 2-day format to the one-day format. So unfortunately, I did not get to experience the 2-day format that did include the specific troubleshooting section. Now, what we're going to be mainly talking about this week is the new troubleshooting section for the one-day lab exam, which is going to be a little bit different than how it was originally formatted in the 2-day. And we will get into the specifics today about what is going to be covered, what is the format, what is the length, those type of questions. So for offline help there, you can see my email address along with Anthony's. Anthony will be joining us a little bit later throughout the week as we get into the actual practical examples of everyone going through some troubleshooting scenarios live on the command line, and then spending some time towards the end of the week going through the different questions, going through a detailed explanation of it, and then kind of wrapping the week up as we get towards the end on Friday. Now, for some additional resources, you can see a couple links there to our CCI blog and to our online community. So after class, whether the class week had finished or just throughout the week you have questions, feel free to visit the blog and the online community The blog, you can submit questions to us that you would like to see us do write-ups on different technical topics, or could be related to how the troubleshooting section works. And then on the online community, you'll see different types of discussion threads that relate to technical topics, and then general exam questions like, what do I need to bring when I get to the exam, that type of stuff. Now, we will do a re-review of that at the end of the week on Friday, so if this is going to be your first attempt going to the lab exam, and you are going to be faced with the new CCI version 4 format as of this Sunday. So assuming that you're not taking the lab this week during class, pretty much everyone is going to be taking the new format starting next week. So we will spend some time at the end of the week talking about what you need to bring for the exam, what is the general format, what you want to expect when you get to the actual lab facility. But as I mentioned, any questions that you have throughout the week, just feel free to submit them to us here. Class participation is key. The more questions that you ask, the more that you are ultimately going to get out of class. Now for class timing, generally we will start around this time, same time in the morning throughout the week, which is going to be 7 a.m. U.S. West Coast time or Pacific time. So when you log into the classroom, make sure that you do check your local time zone conversions. Personally, for me, I'm in Chicago, Illinois, so it's about 10 minutes after 9 a.m. here. Now, as we are going through the lectures throughout the week, I'll try to go no longer than about 50 minutes or so. But if anyone needs break time to go get a cup of coffee or whatever, just feel free to let me know. Sometimes I do get wrapped up in what I'm talking about, and before I know it, I'm an hour and a half into the lecture, and I haven't taken a break. Now, additionally, we'll try to take our lunch break about 10 a.m. Pacific time, and we will break for an hour at that point. Then class should end somewhere around 4 p.m. Pacific time. It's going to be give and take depending on the individual topics that we are covering that day. Some classes may run a little bit longer than that. Some classes may be a little bit sooner than that. But in any case, if there is some reason that you cannot stay through the whole class duration, don't worry, because all of these class sessions are going to be recorded in a class-on-demand format, and they will be available shortly after the class is finished. So by next week time, either Monday or Tuesday, everyone should have access to the recordings of the class sessions that we are doing live this week. Now, the basic agenda throughout the week, as I mentioned, is going to be mainly focused on troubleshooting, and we're going to break this down into two major sections. Now, the first section, which is going to be today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, is going to go through the individual technologies that are within the scope of the blueprint of the CCI lab exam. We're going to talk about what are different common issues for the technologies, what are different verifications that we can do with the show commands, with the debug commands, and I am going to be doing a lot of examples live on the command line, showing how to do this verification, how to do this troubleshooting, breaking different configurations in the network, and then looking at how we would deal with those issues. Now, when we get to Thursday for day 4, this is where you guys are going to take over and be doing live troubleshooting examples, or exercises, I should say, on the command line. And this is going to be formatted similarly to what you would see in the actual exam. So we're going to go through, I believe, 3 different scenarios that are going to have about 10 trouble tickets each. So 3 different topologies that we will be going through, and it's going to be up to you to solve the problems in the network based on the descriptions. Then on Friday, on day 5, we are going to be doing a review of all the individual issues that we saw on Thursday, and then taking people's questions and kind of wrapping the week up as a whole. So for today, mainly we are going to be focusing on layer 2 troubleshooting. Tomorrow and Wednesday is going to be a mix of basically layer 3 and beyond. Now, I didn't put a detailed list of what will actually be covered here, because depending on how many questions people have, we may not get to all of the content tomorrow that I had originally slated. So some of that may be pushed until Wednesday. But either case, by the end of the day, Wednesday, we will have pretty much everything covered that we need to that is within the scope of the lab exam blueprint. Okay, now as I mentioned here, as of next Sunday, or this Sunday, October 18th, 2009, the CCI routing and switching exam format is going to go through a major change through the addition of this new troubleshooting section. So as the exam format stands today, we have the short answer and the open-ended or the open-ended question section followed by the configuration. Starting next week, this is actually going to be split into 3 discrete sections: the open-ended questions, the troubleshooting, and the configuration. Now, the first section, the short answer, is basically going to stay the same, where it is going to be 30 minutes of time. It's going to be 4 questions that we have to get 3 out of 4 correct in order to pass. Troubleshooting is going to be brand new. We'll talk about in detail what the format is of this section, of this new section, then followed by the configuration section, which has been around for quite some time in the exam. But the key point that we will see with the new exam format change is that you do need to pass all 3 sections in order to achieve a passing score in the exam. So technically this means that even if you get the open-ended questions right and the configuration right, if you do not pass the troubleshooting section, then you will not pass the overall lab exam. Now our first section, as I mentioned here, the short answer or the open-ended questions. This is going to be the first section that you will see when you get to the exam in the morning, and you're going to be allotted 30 minutes of time in order to accomplish this. Now, from what all of the proctors have said and the people involved with the CCI program, typically when you are answering these questions, it should not be a novel that you are writing in order to accomplish this. So some of the questions may be answered in just 1 word or 1 or 2 words, but the vast majority of them should be no more than 1 sentence. So ideally, if you know exactly what the question is referring to, it should be fairly straightforward in order to answer it based on what they are looking for. So this week we're not going to focus on the open-ended questions, but I'm sure that Anthony will touch on that again Friday when we talk about the overall exam format and what to expect when you get to the exam. But the key here is that you do need to pass this section in order to achieve a passing score on the entire exam. Now, another key point here to note about the new 3 sections: technically, if you do not pass the open-ended questions, you would not know this until they actually grade the exam afterwards. So there's no delimiter in the exam that says if you don't get these 3 questions right, you cannot continue on to troubleshooting. Regardless of what your score is, you will be going through all 3 sections throughout the day. So starting with the short answers and then proceeding on to the troubleshooting section. So again, troubleshooting, this is where our focus is going to be this week, this new section, which is going to consist somewhere between 8 and 12 trouble tickets, which is going to be a general description of some sort of problem that is going on in the network, whether a user is reporting that they can't send their email or they can't browse the web, or as specific down to maybe an SNMP trap saying that a link is down. The key here is that there's going to be some sort of baseline configuration built in the network design. We are presented with a problem that we must solve, and then the ultimate goal is to get the configuration back to the baseline so that the network is functional. Now, throughout these tickets, it's going to be somewhere between 20 to 25 points, but in either case, you do need to still achieve a passing score on the troubleshooting section in order to pass the exam overall. So it should be somewhere around 80% in order to solve this section. Technically, they didn't give the official numbers yet since the blueprint is not yet in effect. But I would assume, based on how the configuration section works, with traditionally being 80% to pass, it's going to be somewhere similar to here in the troubleshooting section. Now for troubleshooting, you will be allotted 2 hours. You cannot go over this mark, but if you go under this mark, the extra time that you have left over, it can be applied to the configuration section. So as far as I understand it from what the program managers were talking about, there is going to be a timer that is counting down for each individual section as you're working through it. Then if you have time left over in troubleshooting, they will roll this forward into the configuration section. Okay, there's a question here, and it goes along with the last point that I have here on the slide, that the dock CD access is allowed. So if you need to reference the configuration guides or the command references, those will be available. And we will spend a significant amount of time this week, Wednesday, going through the documentation to make sure that we know where all the configurations and the commands are documented. And the second part of the question is, will the show run or show start be allowed in the lab to use? I would assume that it will be. Now, I'm sure this question stems from our new Volume 4 workbook, the Troubleshooting Labs, which one of the recommendations throughout those labs is to not use show run and to not use show start. It's very unlikely that it would be limited to this in the exam. The reason why we do that is to try to get you more familiar with using the other ways of verification in the network, to try to look at a results-oriented verification as opposed to simply just a configuration-related verification. So you can use show run, you can use show start, but you definitely do want to be aware of what all the other tools are for the individual technologies for their verification and troubleshooting. And this is mainly what we're going to be focusing on through Wednesday, is what are the different issues, what are the different show commands, what are the different debug commands, and most importantly, how do we actually interpret the output from them. So a lot of the times, when you look at verification or troubleshooting, there's not always a lot of information on Cisco's website about what does the actual debug output from, say, debug IP OSPF adjacency or some similar technology look like. Okay, now for the actual tickets themselves, in the troubleshooting section, they will be independent, which means that you can configure them in any order that you'd like. The only real stipulation is that once you move out of the troubleshooting section, you cannot come back. So you want to make sure that you have solved all of them sufficiently, or at least to the best of your ability, before you submit and go on to the configuration section. Because if later down the road you want to make a change, you're not allowed to come back to the troubleshooting section. Now, in order to do this, to make sure that each individual troubleshooting ticket or trouble ticket is independent, it implies that the topology that they are using is going to be fairly large. So you may get to the troubleshooting section and see 15, 20, 30 routers or more. Not be intimidated by this. There's no functional difference between a smaller topology that we are going to be looking at, maybe 10 to 13 devices versus 20, 30 devices. In the case of the lab, it just means that you're going to have smaller problems that are more compartmentalized in the network. So you don't need to troubleshoot the overall network of 1,000 devices. It's going to be individual tickets that may relate to 2, 3, 4 devices for that particular issue. Now, as you would assume, when they do the grading for the troubleshooting section, they're only looking for working configurations. So when you actually get the ticket, it will say something like, this is the problem, this is the goal that we're trying to accomplish. Unless you actually do accomplish that goal and meet the requirements of what they're looking for, then you would not get a passing score for that individual ticket. So the troubleshooting section is results-oriented, similar to how the vast majority of the configuration section has been for a long time. So this means, for example, if OSPF is broken in the network, it doesn't matter what commands you enter, in the command line, unless you actually get OSPF back to its functional state, you will not get a passing score for that individual ticket. Now, next point here is that there are going to be no layer 1 troubleshooting issues. So you don't need to deal with cabling or physical device module or WIC problems or memory problems. We're mainly going to be focusing on layer 2 WAN, layer 3 routing, and above. Now, the actual topology that is going to be used for the troubleshooting section is based off of a software package that is known as iOS on Unix, or IOU, which basically is a virtualization for the iOS that is internal to Cisco. So if any of you are familiar with the Dynamips software suite or GNS3, Dynagen, it's a similar logic to that, where IOU is a virtualization for basically the bootloader for the router. So you're loading the actual iOS image directly on a Unix. It's not an iOS simulation program. So from our perspective, there's really no difference between a physical hardware router and the software IOU instance, because it's the same exact code that is running on either of them. Now, the main difference when we compare this to Dynamips is that IOU is written by the actual iOS team, so it's much more stable and it's much more scalable. So unfortunately, there's no way outside of Cisco, unless you work for advanced services or you're an SE, there's no way to get your hands on IOU. But again, from our perspective, it really doesn't matter. As long as you have access to iOS instances, whether it's through actual hardware or whether it's through virtualization like Dynamips or GNS3, it's going to be the same logic. So this means if you get on IOU and you say show tech support or show IP OSPF neighbors, same exact output that you would see on a real hardware box, is it is the actual iOS that we're working with. It's not a flash simulation like you would see in the CCNA or CCNP written exams. Now, one of the limitations of the software is that it is only for the router iOS. It is not for the Catalyst iOS. So basically, this means in the troubleshooting section itself, there is not going to be layer 2 troubleshooting that is related to Ethernet switching. Now, this doesn't mean that Ethernet switching is eliminated. It just means that it will be constrained to the configuration section. So you will not get tickets that are specific to access VLANs or trunking in the troubleshooting section, but you do still need to know these topics for configuration. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, how the initial configurations are going to work for that section. Okay, and last but not least here, the configuration section, which is traditionally what the exam has been based off of. Now this is going to be reduced from 100 points to somewhere around 70, 75, 76% of the overall point values. Now, either way, it really doesn't matter what the point values are. The same with the troubleshooting section, because you still need 80% in order to pass the section. Unless you pass the open-ended questions, the troubleshooting section, and the configuration section, you will not be awarded a passing score for the exam overall. So definitely this is still going to be the main focus of the exam. So you can't shortcut this by skipping over technologies and just praying that you're not going to get them in this section. But the key change, in order to make this section a little bit shorter than it has been in the past, is that there will be more basic configuration for the core topics of the exam. So, example I have here, access VLAN assignments. It's really not a CCI level skill to go into a Catalyst switch and say, switch port access VLAN 10 on the interface. So I would assume that a lot of the basic tasks in the network, maybe establishing VLANs, trunking, basic IP addressing, basic routing protocol establishment, that type of stuff most likely will be done for you already in the configuration section. We're going to be looking at more of the advanced scenarios that would be traditionally considered CCIE level. Now the pre-configuration, this is where our layer 2 Ethernet switching troubleshooting is going to come in. So if they are pre-configuring VLANs, VTP, trunking, Ether channel, spanning tree, whatever, there definitely are going to be potential issues that we need to find and resolve in order to get the rest of the configuration functional. So as we know from our basic layered approach, if layer 1 and layer 2 are not functioning properly in the network, then everything layer 3 and above is going to be non-functional. So if our VLAN assignments aren't right, if our trunking is not correct, then there's no point in doing OSPF routing or BGP routing, because this is definitely going to be dependent on the underlying layer 2 topology. Now, some of the new topics that have been introduced here into the exam, first and foremost is MPLS, which fortunately for you guys is going to be only the layer 3 MPLS VPNs. So it is not going to be a lot of the detailed service provider level topics of MPLS. There's not going to be any L2 VPN, which would be either the any transport over MPLS, the Atom feature, or the virtual private LAN service, the VPLS. That type of stuff is still going to be reserved for the CCIE service provider exam. Now, additionally, advanced SP topics like MPLS traffic engineering, MPLS QoS, MPLS multicast, that type of stuff is not within the scope of routing and switching. That is still going to be reserved for the service provider exam. So this week for troubleshooting MPLS, we will be focusing on the different verification commands for basic VRFs, for VRF Lite, for multi-protocol BGP, for LDP, and then the end-to-end label switch path over the topology. But it's definitely not going to be as complicated as the topic scope that is involved in CCIE service provider. But if you do want to get involved in those topics, once you finish with the routing and switching exam, it's definitely a great launching point for the CCIE service provider, because the SP exam basically is an MPLS exam. So it's advanced traffic engineering, advanced QoS, advanced multicast, all related to the service provider MPLS network. Now, next one we have the optimized edge routing and performance routing features, which if they were covered in the individual scenario that you got, I would venture to guess that it would be a very straightforward configuration. There's a lot of detail that you can get into with performance routing, but it is very time-consuming in order to do these type of configurations, and it also takes longer-term traffic patterns in order to actually get any result out of them. So, for those of you that are subscribed to the open lecture series, there are some videos in there in the class on demand that cover the optimized edge routing and performance routing, and actually those are included in the regular advanced technologies class on demand as well. So if you are not familiar with those topics, I would definitely recommend to take a look at those videos. The overall idea behind OER and PFR is fairly straightforward, but when you look at the syntax, it does get a little bit hairy as to how it's actually implemented and how it is actually verified. Okay, the good point, though, as you can see towards the end here, it says not all topics are going to be on all exams or all sections of the exams. So this means that if you were tested on MPLS or tested on the optimized edge routing, you may get this just in the open-ended questions, not necessarily in the troubleshooting section or the configuration section. So basically, be prepared for anything that is related to these technologies. If you know how to configure and verify them, it implies that you're ready for configuration and troubleshooting. before you even got to the configuration portion in the first place, you should have been reading about what is the technology in the first place, what is the problem it's designed to solve, what are the different features. That's the type of stuff that would prepare you for open-ended questions. So really, I would say with the exam format today, it is a logical flow of how the exam works, because there should not be a configuration that you are implementing in either troubleshooting or the configuration section that you really don't understand why it is working, which is going to be what the open-ended questions are testing on. Really the why behind the technologies. And if you can explain why it is accomplishing what it is, then definitely you are going to be prepared for that section there. Now next we have IPv6 multicast and IPv6 EIGRP. EIGRP, when we compare this to the other routing protocols that were already on the blueprint, OSPF version 3, RIP-NG, possibly multi-protocol BGP, really it's not that much of a stretch to go into EIGRP. So we will talk about IPv6 troubleshooting, which the vast majority of issues will be related to the addressing. So with the large scope of the IPv6 address space, it's very easy to make a mistake in the addressing schemes. So we will talk about other issues for IPv6, how it relates to the WAN technologies, what are some of the other possible routing issues or higher layer issues with IPv6. But definitely something like IPv6 multicast would not be a large focus of the exam. So again, it's possible that maybe you get this in open-ended questions and not configuration or troubleshooting, because you're not guaranteed all topics in all exams or even in all sections. Okay, our next one, the zone-based policy firewall, is the new format for CBAC on the routers, which is going to be the class map type inspect and the policy map type inspect. Definitely would be a great candidate, in my opinion, for the troubleshooting section. Because anytime you start to introduce any type of filtering in the network, whether it's with stateless access lists, so just static standard lists or extended lists, or some sort of active firewall, like reflexive lists, CBAC, or zone-based policy firewall, a lot of the times you run into higher level issues in the network, like the users can't get their email servers or they can't browse the web, or even low-level layer 3 or layer 4 issues, like you lose OSPF adjacency or you cannot telnet to a destination. Any type of firewall filtering is definitely a good candidate to throw these type of problems in. So we definitely need to know what are the different verification steps that we would go through with the new firewall feature set format, and then how we modify this configuration in order to do different types of exceptions and fix any type of filtering logic problems we run into. So we will look at both the original CBAC format and the zone-based policy firewall this week. Now, iOS IPS, the intrusion prevention system, will definitely be a corner case topic. There's not a lot of core information that the IPS could be involved in. So there's no real reason why you would need to configure this in order to get, let's say, OSPF working or BGP working. So it's definitely going to be something peripheral on the side. But we will talk about what are some of the possible issues you could run into and how especially it could negatively impact the rest of the network. So if IPS is misconfigured, you could be filtering out traffic, whether it's related to your routing protocols or whether it's related to your management plane protocols. Definitely a possible issue that you need to be aware of. Okay, any questions up to this point on the new topics of the exam? Okay, so before we get into our technical content for the day, I'm going to take a look at Cisco's website here, and we're going to look at the blueprint to see what is currently covered, and then the information about the new format of the exam. So I'm going to go and open up my web browser here and share out my desktop.